Hello, hello. How is everybody tonight? Hi, Dolores. How are you? Hello, Kay. Hi, Greg. How you doing? Steve Gonzo says Thora a book deer while working for at AOC in 2019. Explicitly remember uninvited Israeli lobbyists constantly coming in her office to lobby. I would greet them, say I'm a native Palestinian woman, and scare them away. All in seconds. My identity was unfettered in that office. Now I am disappointed. Oh, sorry to hear that. Kay says, hi, Steve Gonzo. Gregory says, how's everyone doing this evening? I'm doing fine. Old Gringo says, driving. Can't chat. Hello. Hello to you, Troy. And Greg Mallet says, I'm doing good, Joe. How are you? I'm doing fine, Greg. Doing fine. And Dia says, how about you and Bonnie? We're both doing fine, Dia. Thank you. How are you? Lana says, hi, all. Okay, we're getting, Greg says, I have snacks. You all want some? Snacks at a distance. Okay, so I'm going to get on with it. Let's start with some news on the infrastructure. I shouldn't say situation, the lobbying, the discussions, the searches for support. And let's look at that. Hi, Aaron. How are you? And let me share the screen for this. Oh, yes, I am jumping the gun here. Sorry. Okay, I have to apologize. I didn't mean to take care of infrastructure first. I meant to take care of keystrokes first. So let me begin with the keystrokes and share what I should be sharing on that topic. Specifically, a bit of a PowerPoint I have here. Okay, so this is about, according to MMT, Treasury adding and draining net financial assets. Let's begin with a quote from Doug Henwood. There was a Twitter exchange, with Aaron Taylor, who's here tonight. And Aaron sent a quote through Lana to me, and the quote reads in part, and I've tailored it just a bit because the last part of it was totally irrelevant to the point. So I did cut out a couple of sentences to focus on what was more important. But what Doug Henwood said is the Treasury puts out a monthly statement and a daily statement, which is like its income and its outgo. Looks like any normal financial statement, only with a lot more zeros. They get money either with tax receipts or borrowing and spending. And it's just as simple as that. I think most people who think about this stuff at all would say that's how the government gets money. It borrows or taxes and spends it. And if you look at these daily Treasury statements or monthly Treasury statements, that's absolutely true. The government does not create money with keystrokes like Kelton says. Unquote. So that's the key Henwood quote. Now to critique it, what I'm going to do is start by going through a few slides on what really happens. So here's a graphic on how Treasury spending happens and creates net financial assets. So Congress appropriates Treasury spending. Then the Federal Reserve creates the high-powered reserves that are needed for the Treasury spending account. Why does the Treasury need high-powered reserves? Because those are the reserves it needs to spend into the economy. It spends into the economy basically in two steps. Or at least there are two steps in the clearing process. Specifically, the Treasury's reserves go to the reserve accounts of the banks that have the regular checking accounts of the recipients. So the reserves are spent first into the reserve accounts of the banks that are serving the recipients. And then there's another step, okay, which I've omitted in the graphic, where the banks turn around and credit the recipients. Not with the high-powered reserves. Those stay in the Federal Reserve System itself. They circulate only among the banks in that system. What the recipients receive is the bank money. They get the bank money from their banks. The bank money is denominated, in dollars, and same as the reserves that are sent into the reserve banks. But they are not the high-powered dollars. The high-powered dollars stay in the reserve system. So Treasury spends the reserves into the private sector, specifically sends them into the reserve accounts of the banks, creating financial asset contributions. But from a mechanical point of view, or an electronic point of view, there are reserves sent into the Federal Reserve accounts of the banks. And then, as I say, the banks turn around and they mark up the accounts of the recipients with the bank money. So that's how contributions get into the accounts of the recipients. So then what happens? Then these financial assets are taxed away from the recipients. Not all of the financial assets that were added are taxed away. in the usual simple common sense examples. But suppose a $100 contribution is made by the Treasury into the private sector. Then perhaps 90 cents will stay in the private sector, and the Treasury may tax away 10 cents. Well, usually it's probably considerably more than 10 cents. I don't know, maybe on the average it's 20 cents. I don't know what it is exactly. But not all of it, okay, is taxed away. So there is a net financial asset that stays in the economy. Which is to say, the normal condition, okay, in the economy of the United States is that the federal government spends more into the economy than it taxes back. This is normally thought of as deficit spending, but in fact, it is not a net financial asset contribution that the federal government is making to the private sector in most years, because in most years, the federal government, okay, is running a deficit. This illustrates, of course, a key point of MMT, which is that a federal deficit is actually not a net financial asset contribution into the private economy. So leaving the graphic and putting this into words, Congress appropriates federal spending. The Federal Reserve creates reserves needed to add to the Treasury spending account. Treasury spends the reserves into the non-government sector, creating financial assets. So, quote, direct creation of new high-powered money by Treasury in the non-government sector, quote, finances, unquote, federal spending. So note that. It is very, very important. When the Treasury spends into the private sector, there is, in the act of spending, the direct creation of new high-powered money. Why do we say that? We say that because the high-powered money previously existed in the Treasury spending account. But that was not money in the economy, because the Treasury spending account is not in the private economy. It's not a part of the money supply. Those reserves get added to the money supply in the Treasury's act of spending into the non-government sector. So it's in the direct creation of new high-powered money that the Treasury finances federal spending. As the graphic showed, some of these become net financial assets after taxation drains away some of the financial aspects spent into the economy by the government, which leaves a deficit, okay, a budget deficit. So that's it. Notice, no taxing or selling debt instruments is involved in creating the reserves spent into the non-government sector. So let's go further. Okay, another graphic. How money and net financial assets are drained out of the economy. Well as appropriating spending, Congress also appropriates taxes and delegates to Treasury authority to create and sell debt instruments. Specifically, Treasury collects taxes, tax revenues, and Treasury sells debt instruments. Then Treasury takes these payments and deposits them at the Federal Reserve. But, and here's the key, during the settlement process, the Federal Reserve marks down private sector accounts. That is to say, the Federal Reserve takes money out of the bank accounts, that the banks have in the Federal Reserve system. It marks down the balances in those accounts. And then the private banks turn around and they mark down the bank money accounts of those who bank with them. So now, within the Federal Reserve System itself, the marking down of accounts drains reserves from the private sector, thus destroying those by reserves. So the act of payment and the Treasury depositing the payments doesn't cause the money to go directly into the Treasury spending account. But when the Federal Reserve in settlement drains the reserves from the private sector, it is destroying those the liabilities of the federal government. That is to say, the reserves that had been issued by the Federal Reserve to the private banks within the Federal Reserve system, when they were issued, they became liabilities of the federal government, because the federal government agrees to accept the reserves in the future in payment of obligations to the federal government. So those reserves are liabilities of the federal government. When the Federal Reserve marks down the private sector accounts, it drains the reserves from the private sector, thus destroying those liabilities of the federal government. It destroys them. They no longer exist. And the Federal Reserve does this during the settlement process as it adds, creates, that is, new high-powered reserves within the Treasury spending account. So I hope you're getting that. When the Treasury makes a deposit, it triggers action on the part of the Federal Reserve not to place those private sector reserves into the Treasury spending account, but to destroy those liabilities as it issues new liabilities in the form of new high-powered reserves into the Treasury spending account. Now, that is what happens as a matter of the accounting process. That is what happens from a banking law point of view, from a legal point, of view. The reserves are not transferred from the private sector into the government account. They are destroyed during the process of settlement and then replaced by new high-powered reserves, newly created by the Federal Reserve, which are added during the settlement process into the Treasury spending account, which, of course, as many of you know, is called the Treasury General Account and sits at the New York Fed. So, just to run through this quickly, Congress appropriates and delegates to Treasury authority to create and sell debt instruments. Treasury collects tax revenues. Treasury sells debt instruments to the non-government sector and collects the proceeds. Treasury deposits tax bond sale proceeds. During settlement, the Federal Reserve marks down non-government sector accounts, draining reserves from that sector, in the process destroying the reserves as it creates new high-powered reserves to or in the Treasury spending account. So then the big question, the key $64,000 question, of relevance, maybe it's a $64 trillion question, of relevance to what Henwood has to say. So, how can taxes or bond sales, quote, pay for, unquote, or, quote, finance, unquote, federal spending when tax and bond sale revenue is destroyed and new high-powered money is created in the Treasury spending account before Treasury spends? So in sum, it's not the same money. It's not the same dollars. The original liabilities that had been issued and was sitting in the bank accounts in the Federal Reserve system, when they're settled during the payment process, are redeemed by the Federal Reserve. They're federal liabilities that are legally redeemed, which means they're destroyed. Of course, though, the Federal Reserve has to credit, according to its banking rules, the Treasury spending account. How does it credit the Treasury spending account? Well, the act of crediting it is the act of creating new high-powered money in the Treasury spending account. So that's what happens. But there's also something important, you have to note here. All this is going on before Treasury spends. It's before Treasury spends. So what's the situation after that occurs? The situation is that money then exists, reserves then exist in the Treasury spending account, but not in the non-government sector, not in the economy, not as part of the money supply. However, it's those reserves that Treasury is going to spend into the private sector, or I should say into the non-government sector. And as it spends that money into the non-government sector, it creates, through its spending, the high-powered money as part of the money supply in the non-government sector. So it's the Treasury that is paying for or financing federal spending. It's the Congress that is appropriating the federal spending. It is the Federal Reserve that is using the money creation power of the Congress under the Constitution delegated to it in order to top up the Treasury spending account. But it is the Treasury that is spending, and through the act of spending, creating the new money in the non-government sector accounts within the Federal Reserve System, which then trigger further deposits of bank money into the recipient accounts. Now, to underline that, for a moment, I'm going to go back to for the moment, I'm going to stop sharing that screen, and I'm going to take you to the famous paper by Stephanie Kelton, Can Taxes and Bonds Finance Government Spending? You'll find it at the Levy Institute. I've left you a link to it on page 21 of the paper, numbered page, but 21, page 23 of the PDF. Stephanie asks the question, how, if not by using the money received in payment of taxes and bond sales, does the government finance its spending? She said, notice that the government writes checks on an account that does not comprise part of the money supply, but part of the money supply or the high-powered money, but that as it does, the funds become part of the money supply. And she says, M1 if deposited into checking accounts, M2 if savings accounts, etc. And part of the high-powered money, she might have added, in the private sector. Doesn't start out as part of the high-powered money, in the private sector, but as it spends. It is therefore apparent that while the payment of taxes destroys an equivalent amount of money, M1 immediately, and HPM, as the proceeds go into the Treasury's account at the Fed, Spending from this account creates an equivalent amount of new money, both bank money and high-powered money. And then the critical sentence, the modern governments then finance all of their spending through direct creation of new high-powered money. Just that short paragraph contains the meat of what she is saying. Okay, now people often misinterpret this. What they focus on, probably because of debt ceiling problems and other problems, and the sort of implicit assumption that the Federal Reserve is not actually a part of the government, and for numerous other reasons. They focus on the point that someone's creating the reserves for the Treasury. But what Stephanie is saying here, and what the keystrokes are about, okay, is that modern governments finance all of their spending through a direct creation of new high-powered money. That's a reference to the Treasury spending the new high-powered reserves it's gotten into the non-government sector. That's what she's talking about. The keystrokes she's talking about is the keystrokes that send the money through the Federal Reserve System to the recipients at the other end. Of course, the reserves never actually get through the system. The high-powered money only circulates inside of the system, the Federal Reserve System. But it triggers bank money deposits in the accounts of the recipients. So that's what she's talking about. I don't know if Doug Henwood actually realized that. But whether or not he does, that is what is going on there. So let me go back to the PowerPoint. And give you the final conclusion, of this analysis. Here are my conclusions on the Henwood quote. He says, they get money either with tax receipts or borrowing and spending. And it's just as simple as that. No, it's not. The Treasury gets new high-powered reserves from its bank, the Fed, whenever its spending account is topped up, specifically at the New York Fed. The new money is not tax or bond receipts. These federal liabilities are destroyed during settlement transactions. That's what really happens. Further, it doesn't matter what most people think. That was part of the Henwood quote, of course. Okay, but it's irrelevant what most people think. The only thing that's relevant is what actually goes on. Those accounting facts may be facts that are created by man, may be facts that are created by us, but on the ground, they are facts in the banking system. The federal liabilities are destroyed during the settlement transactions. That's a fact. It doesn't matter what most people think. It doesn't matter that people don't understand this. It doesn't matter that people don't care about the accounting. That is what actually happens. The daily or monthly Treasury statements are irrelevant to the argument, since they would look the same whether the reserves going into the Treasury spending account were old money or new money. They would look the same, because if you look at a daily Treasury statement, okay, I'm going to go back now. And I'm going to shift you over to a daily Treasury statement. There it is. This is a daily Treasury statement for April 8th from the Federal Reserve account. It shows, among other things, in Table 2, deposits and withdrawal, okay, of operating cash. It shows the withdrawals are being paid. The cash is being paid. Payments, okay, are being sent to various recipients, so the recipients can spend in some way as a matter of the accounting. Okay, and you can see there are payments, okay, going out from the Treasury Department to various sources. Some of them are sources inside the government for specific purposes, specific payments made on behalf of those parts of the government to recipients outside of the government. And you see, there are all sorts of withdrawals going out. See the big numbers for the public debt, cash, by redemption, paying off of the public debt. Also note this is detail rounded in millions. So this stuff is rounded, okay, in millions. See big figures for the unemployment benefits going out. But the biggest figures are for redemption of debt. Look at all those payments going to redemption of debt. $500 million just in one day. I'm sorry. But these are in the millions. Yeah, 500 million just in one day. In the fiscal year to date, there's already, what is it? 10 billion that's already been redeemed. No, must be 10 trillion, that figure. I'm not sure. But the point I'm trying to make here is that this is an accounting of the income and the outgo of entities that made payments which were deposited by the Treasury. But there's no way to tell from this income, okay, and outgo, what the details of the settlement process actually were. So this statement is in no way relevant to the issues being raised by Henwood. It is in no way relevant to the keystroke issue. And the reason why it's not is simply because it does not reflect that internally the Federal Reserve is destroying money through the marking down of accounts and creating new money through the marking up, okay, of the reserve accounts. It doesn't speak to that. It just doesn't. It would look the same. It would look the same whether Henwood was right, okay, or whether Kelton is right. He just brought in something completely irrelevant to the issue. The only thing that is irrelevant is the specific accounting facts, the accounting facts on the ground. So finally, Kelton is right. Treasury creates money in the non-government sector as it keystrokes the payments to people that go through the Federal Reserve system. That is what happens, because things today are done by using computers. When the Treasury sends you a Social Security payment into its bank account, it is keystroking money in. When it sends you stimulus payments, it is keystroking money in. Even when it sends you checks, what's the first step when it sends checks? Keystroking the money. Keystroking the money to create the checks. So, one way or another, it's always keystroking the money. It's got to keystroke the money because there are only reserves in the Treasury spending account. That's it. And that's what exists there. So, I tried to do this as thoroughly as I could. I hope you like the detail in it. I'm trying to give you an in-depth understanding of what really goes on and why almost everything that Henwood had to say in that quote was just irrelevant and just reflects the fact that he doesn't understand what goes on in the banking system, and he does not understand how Treasury actually finances the spending. Okay. So I hope that cleared that up. I'm now going to go on to infrastructure. And I promise that won't be so hard. So this is a Jake Johnson article from Common Dreams on April 9th. Economists warn Democrats, quote, going too small on infrastructure risks economic climate catastrophe. I believe, of course, this is dead right. And, of course, the economists, as well as progressive lawmakers and activists, are pressing members of Congress to dramatically expand the $2.3 trillion infrastructure proposal in order to equitably rebound from the coronavirus crisis, achieve full employment, and combat the existential climate emergency. And this refers to a report by Mark Paul and Adam Hirsch, who argue that the costs of allowing the economy to run too cold, quote unquote, by underspending on pressing needs far outweigh the risks of inflation and other potential consequences, of overshooting. They want Congress to consider around $10 trillion in spending on core infrastructure, caregiving, and green energy to rebuild the nation. Of course, I think you know that I want them to consider spending $16.2 trillion over 10 years, specifically according to the plan that was laid out by Bernie Sanders during his campaign. I don't even think that 10 trillion's enough. Okay, I'm not going to go through this in depth. Basically, Hirsch and Paul say that failure to adequately invest in transitioning the energy system away from fossil fuel risks disasters far more severe than the COVID-19 pandemic. I certainly agree with that. They refer to the mistakes of 2009, when Democrats prolonged the crisis by settling for a stimulus that was far too austere. And in doing so, they guaranteed a lost decade that led to tragedies perpetrated by both parties. And in the last year, or I should say in the last 4 years of the decade, led to tragedies mainly perpetrated by the Republican Party. And we all know what those tragedies were. The economists estimate that the 2009 crash ultimately cost the U.S. economy, and of course the failed response, at least $8.2 trillion in GDP combined from 2010 to 2019. And they translate that into an average of $32,317 in lost income per adult. That might be, an underestimate, and curious as to what kind of estimate for that period of time would have come out, of Bill Mitchell, if he had been consulted for this particular report. I suspect that even by 2013, we were looking at losses of roughly $9 trillion. But anyway, there is the report by Hirsch and Paul. There's a link to it in this article. I recommend it. Of course, the CPC has similar ideas to what is in the report. And according to a document obtained by Politico on Friday, the CPC, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, is pushing Congress to invest $450 billion in Medicaid home and community-based services, make access to child care a universal benefit, establish permanent paid family and medical leave, spend $70 billion to address the public housing repair backlog, make energy efficiency by weatherization upgrades consistent with the Green New Deal for public housing, cap drug prices at the average price in other OECD companies, use savings to pay for lowering the Medicare eligibility age and expanding benefits to include dental, vision, and hearing. Of course, the CPC didn't want to just put Medicare for all front and center, which they should have done. It probably wouldn't even have cost too much in additional funding, because we probably can't afford to cover the whole population for 2/3 of what we spend on medical expenditures. But right now, with all the waste coming out of the private sector, they want to create millions of clean jobs in the renewable energy sector to help to meet emissions reductions through binding enforceable federal clean energy standards. They want to establish or enhance public employment programs to directly put Americans to work serving the public interest, including the robust funding of a civilian climate corps, the new CCC, the Public Health Jobs Corps, and Resilience Jobs Corps, and provide a roadmap to citizenship for essential workers, TPS recipients, and dreamers. And the chair of the CPC, Pramila Jayapal, said, quote, "We agree it's time for transformative change. We look forward to working with the Biden administration to expand on their proposal and ensure that the American Jobs Plan goes big to truly meet the needs of the Republic." So they're looking to get something much larger out of the stimulus bill than what has been proposed thus far. So the next piece that I want to look at and comment on is by Bob Hockett and Robert C. Hockett. Bob Hockett wrote in the New Consensus blog, this post entitled "Winter Booms," booms, quote unquote, question mark. "When are they merely inflations," quote unquote, question mark. And Bob posted this on April 7th. "Sometimes it seems as though every time public officials return to talking about productive Hamiltonian public investment or speak in a balanced way of rebalancing productive relations long since gone out of balance, unbalanced people begin crying inflation. We are used to this coming from self-styled conservatives, quote unquote. But when center-left wonks do this," and by the way, that link is to something by, guess who, Larry Summers, "even after conservatives leave off, one must wonder there's some kind of cosmic irony or maybe Stockholm syndrome at work." Coming from Larry Summers, of course, this isn't new or surprising. It's a great way of drawing attention back to yourself after having been nudged from the limelight by, gasp, our first woman Fed chair, and now our first woman Treasury Secretary. Will he ever recover? Having edged Summers out from the job he wanted, Fed chair, Janet Yellen now holds the job he once had, Treasury Secretary. And by all reckoning thus far, she's proving far better at the job, far more attentive to what worrisome facts on the ground warrant and even require than Summers ever was, even with all those genetics behind him. What is more surprising than Summers' recent outbursts, however, is what we are hearing from the Martin Wolf and even Raghuram Rajan, who is smart enough, humble enough, and socially conscientious enough to know better, darkly warning of, quote, of runaway inflation, unquote, quote, labor militancy, unquote, and, quote, or riotous spending, unquote. Both authors seem poised to become new Cassandras, worried more about falling skies than about rising floors and higher ceilings, given how, quote, outlier these warnings seem. Should we attend to them? Should we pay any mind at all? He says, I think we should, and my reason is simple. Saying what goes unsaid in these recent columns can show us precisely why building back better, our President Biden, is apt to prove not only non-inflationary, but actually counter-inflationary. That's kind of important now that our second New Deal, our Green New Deal, is at last gathering political steam. Okay, I love the way Bob throws that phrase in their faces, even though he knows President Biden in no way wants to hear that particular phraseology. He doesn't mind the second New Deal. He wants to be compared to FDR. But Green New Deal is just a bridge too far for Mr. Biden, evidently. Start with Wolf, says Bob Hockett. Wolf introduces his discussion by journeying into history. He first recaps the stagflationary, quote unquote, late 1960s and 1970s, the period that prompted the Reagan reaction, whose devastating consequences are precisely what Building Back Better is all about reversing. In so doing, he notes that while oil price shocks and demographic change played some role in reducing stagflation, so did what he calls, quote, domestic spending and labor militancy, quote unquote. The terrible upshot was what Wolf calls, quote, an era of terrible performance for asset prices. Quote, stocks, he continues, quote again, did terribly too, unquote. The stock markets, it seemed, was saying that capitalism was finished, unquote. And so what we had was what Wolf calls, quote, a financial disaster, unquote. Bob says, this is quite telling when you think about it of what capitalism, quote unquote, apparently was in the eyes of the privileged of the era. But is it really what Rajan, Wolf, Summers, and their peers think that capitalism is and must be today? Yet more surprising is what Wolf tells us austerity, labor suppression, and financial deregulation from the Thatcher and Reagan eras on down brought in the way of putatively welcome corrective, namely, quote, a prolonged and remarkable boom in asset prices, unquote. Now, why is this interesting? Well, because language. The boom to which Wolf refers has another name, quote, a bubble, unquote. And a bubble in asset markets is nothing more than, wait for it, a hyperinflation in those markets. I have to differ a little with here. We've certainly had inflation in those markets, but I don't think the inflation is really accelerating enough to yet be called a hyperinflation in those markets. But it is already creating something of a crisis, of course. Do you see what's happening here then, says Robert? What Wolf is effectively telling us is that the inflation in consumer goods markets that characterized the 1970s was simply rerouted to financial markets in the 1980s, where it has remained ever since. And he's saying that this was a good thing. Now, the great Thatcher-Reagan rerouting of inflation from goods and services to asset markets is hardly surprising in light of the mass transfer of purchasing power from labor to capital. I wouldn't say from labor to capital, I would say from labor to the rich. Okay, in other words, from workers to the rich. In a way, labor and capital, those are two abstract sectors. I'm more interested in the people than I am in the abstract sectors. Going on anyway. Also orchestrated by Thatcher and Reagan. Then John Major. Two Bushes, Blair, Clinton, Cameron, May, Johnson, and Trump over the ensuing 40 years. For wealthy owners, typically max out on consumption long before they grow uber wealthy. There are few places left for their money to go, absent taxation, than the City of London and Wall Street, the betting markets. Why then is one called presumptively deleterious inflation, while the other is called a presumptively welcomed, quote, remarkable boom, unquote? I have my suspicions, says Bob, but let us move on to our next exhibit first. Look now to what Rajaram tells us. Unlike Wolf, Rajan avoids celebrating asset price booms. He wrote importantly, after all, in the role played by inequality in generating the last great financial meltdown, as well as the role played by asset price bubbles in exacerbating inequality. His fault line should still be required reading for all, as should be Martin's own Fixing Global Finance. What did Raju once gave? What Raju once gave with the left hand, he now takes back with the right. For while he does not protest, as Martin effectively does on behalf of Wall Street, as prospective payer in the event that in future we must open more fiscal space, he does in effect capitulate to capital, quote unquote. He avers that quote, it will be hard to make the rich pay. They will oppose new taxes vigorously and avoid them if implemented. The riotously decrying, quote, a riot of U.S. spending, unquote, while posing as protector of, here we go again, quote, future generations, unquote. Moreover, he sounds an awful lot like Wall Street's favorite Republican representatives in past Congresses. What gives? Raju's counsel of despair and preemptive surrender is, it seems to me, nothing short of flabbergasting. Did Piketty and Occupy simply not happen? Did Bernie and AOC not happen? Did Trump's popular ersatz population not happen? Did George Floyd's murder, the Black Lives Matter, and Joe Biden's Damascene conversion not happen? Heck, did Broadway's Hamilton and our humble think tank New Consensus not happen? The same rising tide of political energy that has at long last returned us to our anti-austerian, egalitarian, pro-planetarian, Hamiltonian state capitalist roots is still rising inexorably. This is no time to surrender preemptively a la first term Obama to either austerians or Wall Street tax cut enthusiasts. We're past that now. The despair and dark pessimism, not to mention the Wall Street apologetic written to Rajan's take, is both democratically enervating and out of step with the times, which are more reminiscent of those of the New Deal and Great Society than we have seen since, well, the New Deal and the Great Society. And this time, no war or Cold War need derail us, for unlike his predecessors over the past 40 years, President Biden, quote, gets, unquote, that such global competition as there is itself economic and state capitalist. So what does this tell us about now and about the coming rebalancing that Rajan, Wolf, Summers, and very few others read not as rebalance, but as, quote, riotous spending, labor militancy, quote unquote, and, quote, the specter of inflation, unquote. Intriguingly, Wolf, in effect, drops a hint in his recounting of the 1960s and 1970s. One country that didn't experience stagflation in this period and accordingly didn't destructively rebalance, quote unquote, by moving to financial hyperinflation instead was Germany. What did and what does Germany do that we have, didn't, and don't? Might we find there how to build back better sustainably here? The answer is yes. And the Biden administration, unlike Summers and apparently a few others, thankfully seems to have, quote, got the memo. What Germany did and still does is never to stop producing, never to stop productive investment, and thus never to need countenance the unjust suppression of labor or unwise financialization of its economy. Germany has also long understood, since List and Bismarck at latest, that even public expenditure that the Reaganauts and latter-day Clintonites seem to think, trafficking in that most pseudo of pseudo distinctions, quote, more social than infrastructural, unquote, is infrastructural and efficiency growing precisely by being social and justice spreading. For it promotes labor mobility and thereby good factor flow, just as all good infrastructures do. That is still capitalism, but it's a capitalism that works through and in reasonable part with and for labor, not against labor. In effect, a fusion of laborism and capitalism. Only this form of capitalism, labor capitalism, is non-self-destructive. This is what building back better at this point is looking like. The plan is very much aimed both at massively jump-starting green infrastructure and industry on the one hand, and at massively boosting and spreading productive opportunity and capacity to incipient producers, that is, to all of us, on the other hand. Each boost, meanwhile, operates both generally economy-wide on the one hand, and in particularly concentrated form among long neglected sectors of our economy and society on the other hand. This is why Biden speaks so often of rural America and non-white male America along with the rest of America. The tax offsets to limit deficit growth, meanwhile, can easily be made to target outsourcing and offshoring firms owned by Wall Streeters, those whose fortune Summers, Wolf, and Rajan seem by implication either to favor or to be willing to surrender preemptively to, not by working Americans. In other words, the tax offsets can easily be made to target the elitist, financialist activities rather than to be made to target by working Americans. I certainly hope the Biden administration is looking to do that, but I'll believe that when I see it. It would be hard to overstate the significance of this shift, says Bob. It represents a return to the Hamiltonian growth model that served us so well for 150 years and serves Germany, Japan, South Korea, and now China well to this day. The prophet of Germany's strategy was Friedrich List, who cheerfully acknowledged Hamilton's influence, as did the architects of Asia's tiger economies, quote unquote. This is a model that looks not merely to financial industries as measures of our economy's success, but to production industries, infrastructure report cards, quote unquote, and indicators of human well-being like job quality and quantity, educational attainment, health and longevity, and the like. It might be difficult after 40 years of financialization in the Anglo-American world to persuade people like Summers and Wolf to stop fixating on asset price indices and associated Wall Street wealth metrics as measures of national success. But that doesn't mean we need follow them. When we hear talk of, quote, inflation, unquote, and asset price booms, quote unquote, going forward, then let us remember that these are the same thing, differing only in respect of cui bono, who benefits. And when we hear talk of, quote, labor demands, unquote, on the one hand, and, quote, bond market balking on the other, let us remember that these are the same too, differing only in respect of who is demanding what. Given how workers and financiers have fared over the past 40 years, I don't think I'm being eccentric in saying that Main Streeters are due more and Wall Streeters do less, if in fact we must choose. And as it happens, in any case, we needn't yet choose. Both sets of interests remain complementary for us as long as we have fiscal space, of which we have plenty for now. Thank goodness President Biden appears now to see that. Let us now see and act on it, too. Now, I thought that was a brilliant column, absolutely, by Robert, and just really touched, okay, on all of the bases here in terms of arguing for expansiveness and why we need that expansiveness in the infrastructure plan, not even just in the infrastructure bill, but with what we've been talking about over the last a few days, the multiple infrastructure bills that we ought to be able to legislate at this point within this fiscal year, not just one infrastructure bill. And by the way, today I noticed, in fact, I noticed it in the Daily Treasury Statement, that right now the government is operating under a suspension of the debt limit. The suspension of the debt limit ends on July 31st, 2021. So on August 1st, 2021, the debt limit is going to kick in again. And you can be sure we're already way over the debt limit. So if that's not extended or something isn't done, we're going to face a debt ceiling crisis, probably at the end of July. I haven't heard anybody else even suggesting that. But I do recall this, that the COVID-19 relief bill had nothing about the national debt in it, as far as I remember. Therefore, there remains the possibility of a reconciliation bill that 51 Democrats, including the vice president, could pass without any Republican support or Republican votes to remove the debt limit, repeal the debt limit entirely, once and for all, so we no longer have any debt ceiling crises. That could be done in an afternoon. Well, maybe a few afternoons, because it's got to be sent over to the House, then sent over to the president in order to sign it. But we need to get that albatross off our necks with Democratic majorities in both chambers. The thing the Democrats should do right now, even before they do anything else, is get rid of the debt ceiling entirely while they have the votes. It is so important not to have any more debt ceiling crises and be in a position where the Republicans can hold the Democrats hostage to roll back various valuable programs in return for their raising the debt ceiling until the next debt ceiling crisis occurs. We got to stop that. That's so important. Okay. Anyway, in the face of Robert's expansiveness, okay, and optimism and zeal for Hamiltonian public investment, we have to ask the question, how does this square with the wonderful piece that Stephanie turned out for the New York Times, okay, a few days ago, which we've already gone over here? Let's go back to that wonderful piece. Here, Stephanie says, Biden can go bigger and not pay for it the old way. So that is completely consistent, okay, with what Robert has to say and with Hamiltonian investment. But there's lots of cautionary stuff here concerning the possibility of igniting inflationary overheating, especially if Congress goes way higher. And she calls for responsibly spending vast sums of money by carefully managing the economy's real productive limits. She doesn't want to just ramp up spending. She wants to ramp up spending in full realization of resource limits within various sectors of the economy. And she wants a plan She wants a rollout plan that will allow us to meet contingencies where construction workers, architects, raw materials, machinery, and so on might not be available to allow us to successfully implement the infrastructure program without getting into inflationary shortages. She points out how important it is to be very careful about this, not just to focus on aggregate statistics and thinking about the size of deficits, things like that, but how the investments have to be planned to enhance our economy's productive capacity, leaving us with a better educated and more productive workforce, more efficient railways, less congested roadways, improved technologies, and much else. But that's going to take years. And we may start to run out of available capacity as we go. She says, no one can predict exactly when or across which industries serious bottlenecks and other shortages might emerge. We may have to look elsewhere for capacity. We may have to get the capacity by trading in certain things to bring them over here. Biden promised not a contract will go out that I control that isn't for a company that is an American company with American products all the way down the line. We all feel that way, I'm sure. Okay, I think my article has gone south here. But you get the picture, okay, in any case. In that piece, she calls very reasonably and very successfully, I think, for extremely careful planning. And well, she might. That is absolutely vital. Hang on a second. Let's see if I can. I did anticipate that this might happen, so I guarded against it by downloading the article previously while I still had access to it. So if you will be patient for just a moment. I will be able to access that once again. Here we go. There we are. So there is a PDF of the article. Let me see if I can get to where I was in it. So she wants our third policy, our trade policies to be such that if we need capacity from abroad in order to bring the infrastructure program to fruition here, that we have trade policies that support this. She wants us to repeal tariffs so that it would make it easier and cheaper for American businesses to buy supplies that are manufactured abroad, and easier for consumers to spend more of their income on products made outside of our borders, draining off some of the pressures on domestic demand, which we are likely to find if we really expand our infrastructure spending, in the way we would like to. The Biden team, she says, could also consider loosening its legal immigration policies so that even once America nears full employment, there would still be an adequate labor pool to meet the increased demand for workers. Putting aside the obvious climate benefits of tightening environmental regulations, banning fracking on federal lands and offshore drilling in federal waters could free up people and materials for other activities. Healthcare reform could have a role too. And of course, I'm sure she has in mind Biden's opposition to Medicare for all, and says here, significantly lowering the Medicare eligibility age would sharply reduce aggregate spending in the healthcare industry, a major source of price pressures in the economy. And of course, she's right about that. But we need to keep pushing for Medicare for all, because that would even more sharply reduce aggregate spending in the healthcare industry. Over time, the Biden plan's investments in physical and infrastructure will enhance the productive capacity of the economy. As I've already said, he promised not a contract will go out that I control. It isn't for a company that is an American company with American products all the way down the line and American workers. And she says the Buy American philosophy is well-intentioned, but could lead to counterproductive trouble, particularly since the president has promised that, quote, no one making under $400,000 will see their federal taxes go up, a pledge that takes raising taxes on the middle class, which has a higher marginal propensity to spend, off the table as a potential inflation offset. A Biden-led plan that is overly protectionist is a much greater inflation threat than a plan that isn't paid for in the traditional deficit-neutral budgetary sense. This framework, based on the principles of MMT, redefines fiscal responsibility by flipping the age-old question, quote, how will you pay for it, unquote. The real challenge is, quote, how will you resource it, unquote. And he says, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont recently hinted at this approach when he said to Politico, quote, you don't start off by coming up with a sum and working down. You start out by looking at the needs that need to be addressed and adding them up, unquote. The next step is to figure out how to budget your available resources to deliver on these priorities. And then she starts to discuss Keynes's plan on how to pay for the war, a radical plan for the chancellor of the exchequer in the run-up to the Second World War. And says more recently, economists like Randy Ray, and Yevhen Nersessian have begun to think about how to pay for a Green New Deal using Keynes's earlier radical framework. So that was important. So there are points of articulation here with Bob Hockett and what he had to say. But there's a focus on not simply the macroeconomics of the situation and not simply the politics of the situation, but also a focus on the more microeconomic considerations which emerge out of particular sectors of the economy and the need to make sure that spending into these sectors is carefully monitored and carefully coordinated and articulated with respect to the productive capacity of those particular sectors. And she ends by saying, if Congress and the White House want to be responsible stewards of both society and the US dollar's value, then rather than focusing on taxation of the rich, they should prioritize and supply exactly what it would take in terms of real resources to electrify the nation's power grid, repair every deficient bridge, give caretakers a living wage, upgrade our railways, and deliver clean drinking water and high-speed broadband to every home. How many people will it take to do all of that work? How much steel, concrete, and fiber optic cable? How many tower cranes and other kinds of building equipment will be needed? The list goes on. These are the questions we should ask our leaders and the ones they should be asking themselves, not, quote, how will we pay for it, unquote. So, I think putting together what Stephanie had to say and what Robert had to say can give us real insight into the problems that we face in successfully going through the infrastructure program, so we don't waste this wonderful opportunity we have, hopefully, to really do some great things. So, I'll go back to the beginning now and start to cover your comments. I see most of you are still here. Thank you. Always good to see you hanging in there. Steve Gonzo says, in one day we got news that Amazon didn't unionize. Biden wants an expanded military budget. The DAPL is continuing construction. And we're at a record high atmospheric carbon. Actually, we got that a few days ago. He says, sorry, I'm Debbie Downer today. Why can't we have a Donald Downer every once in a while? Why does it always have to be a Debbie Downer? Kay says, I agree, Steve. But Aaron Taylor says, that's fascinating. Dia Swift says, this is so important to know. Thank you, Doctor. Aaron says, it really is. Aaron says, I don't think Doug Hanwood will ever. Well, he keeps brushing off the accounting facts. He keeps thinking the accounting doesn't exist. I mean, without the damned accounting, he'd never get his money. Kay says, Kelton was on Ali Velshi when he sat in on O'Donnell's show last night. Yeah, I haven't had a chance to look at that yet. I've been meaning to look at that. Aaron says, this is helpful, Dr. Joe. Thank you, Aaron. Dia Swift says, when you say the government spends into the public sector, That means allocating credits electronically on spreadsheets, right? Sugar says, is Joe sharing these slides? Yeah, I've been sharing the slides. You should have been able to see them. But Aaron says, yeah. Steve Gonzo says, not to mention, nurses filling rubber gloves with warm water so isolated COVID patients won't feel like they're dying alone. Oh boy. That's really something, isn't it? Aaron says, damn. Kay says, I finally got my J&J vax the other day, but I am so sick of the life we've been forced into these days, Steve. Kay says, I just want a life worth living in my old age. Is that too much to ask for? No, not too much to ask for. Sugar says, excellent job. But Aaron says it's very helpful. Pilana says, Henwood is a pill. Thank you very much for clarifying. Sugar says, people get so lost in talking about the paper economy and how it relates to reality. Aaron says, he's so smug and unpleasant. Yeah, I know. I've been watching him on Twitter the last few days. The first time I've really attended to him. I mean, I noticed, of course, his original post, okay, and Randy Ray's answer, Pavlina's answer, okay, and so on. But I never really looked at his Twitter feed before. He's really, he's awful. Aaron, yes, he is. John O'Rourke says, Dr. Firestone gives a very good detail of how tax revenues are destroyed in the reserve account. And simultaneously, the Treasury creates new Howard money in the Treasury General. This is new money, the old money in the reserve account. Now, oddly, an economics created by Keystrokes can be spent back in the system. The problem is that a person, well, it's not odd that an equal and opposite amount is created by keystrokes in the Treasury General account, but it's not created by Treasury keystrokes in the Treasury General account. There, it's created by Federal Reserve keystrokes going into the Treasury General account. But that's not how the federal government spends its money into the non-government sector. That's how one part of the government, the Federal Reserve, adds reserves to the account of the part of the government that is empowered by Congress to spend net financial assets into the economy. Remember, the Federal Reserve is not empowered to spend net financial assets into the economy. All the Federal Reserve can do is swap. It can swap. It can spend money into the economy in return for financial assets of equal value. So it can do swaps. It can then sell those financial assets back into the economy for reserves of equal value. That's what the Fed can do. It can go back and forth with squats, but it's prohibited from creating net financial assets in the non-government economy. That is Treasury's job. Okay. Also, by the way, everything that I said in my explanation of how we destroy revenues and create new high-powered money comes out of that paper by Stephanie Kelton, Can Taxes and Bonds Finance Federal Spending? It's all based on that paper. So if you want to go to the horse's mouth, you go to that paper and you see the original formulation. And you read it over 3 or 4 times until you remember, okay, or understand it. And is one of the most important single papers in the whole MMT literature. So read it. 3 or 4 times. My presentation comes right out of there. Kay says, like Professor Wolf better, laugh out loud. And Antonio Calhoun says, thank you, Joseph M. Firestone. Thank you for coming, Antonio. Antonio says, long time no see. Lana says, Robert Hockett is brilliant. Yeah, he is brilliant. He really is. Lana says, we better get the spending in before it expires. I forgot about this. Steve Gonzo said, spiders ordered food on the web long before man. Steve Gonzo says, Savage Joy Marie, hey, at Twitter support, my stalker is back. Are you still going to ignore all their harassment, lies, attacks, and slander, regardless of how many people report it? Antonio Calhoun, when it comes to infrastructure, all cement companies are foreign. They all squeeze the bond market. Oh, that's interesting. Kay says, last I checked, wasn't Halliburton a cement company? One of their subsidiaries a cement company? And aren't they an American company? Or did they move offshore? Kay says, glad I never joined Twitter at this point. Kay says, we are patient, Joe. We love and respect you. Thank you, Kay. Antonio says, genuinely American. Companies like Bechtel, CHM2 Hill, the USA has very many consultant, engineer, architect firms. That is good, very good, and project managers. The problem appears to be imported stuff. But if a nation does not import, people get into a bond war. Aaron says, wow, 10T would really make a difference. Well, it's 10T over 10 years, Aaron. It's only $1 trillion a year. Remember, the space we have for deficit spending it's like $2.6 trillion a year. We can go to 16T without trouble. That's $1.6 trillion a year. Now, I'm not talking total expenditures now of the federal government. I'm just talking about the deficit spending that we ought to be maintaining to stay with full employment. I'm just talking a full employment budget now, the kind of deficit that would be appropriate for maintaining a full employment budget. Antonio says, in healthcare, the USA has been obscenely abused. Not only the insurance, but look at the suppliers. Yeah, I know, especially the drug suppliers. Oh, God. Antonio says, yes, how do we gay for it? Evelina, Kay says, Evelina, we are here, but where is Evelina? Lana says, hashtag job guarantee. Indeed, hashtag job guarantee. $650 billion a year to start for the job guarantee. Going down to $350 billion after about 6 months, probably. Kay says, Evelina can't find us. Old Gringo says, Debbie Downer, Donald Downer. The Baldy Downer. Who's the Baldy Downer? By Demonaldi Downer. Says old Gringo. Okay. Okay, guys. I've come to the end of your comment thread at this point. I'm about to drink a little of my wine at this point. So, I'm going to say goodnight. Thank you for staying, but thank you for being here. I got a bunch of stuff accumulated. So I'd like to try to do some short takes, but I got very busy days. Okay, I got to get a scan on Monday, and we generally do our shopping, okay, on Monday. And I got some things set up for tomorrow also. I will try my best to do some short takes because I got some things that have piled up on me. So El Gringo says good night all, and Kay says another great discussion. Thank you and love you all. She says thank you all and love you all. We love you too, Kay. And El Gringo says wine, Kickapoo Joy Juice. Yeah, it's just $3 chuck, folks. Just $3 chuck. Anyway, have a great Saturday. Have a great Sunday. And have a great day on Monday. And I'll for sure see you Tuesday night. Hopefully I'll see you before then.